Good morning. How are you? Hello, everybody.
Hi.
Okay, this will be our final
Morning.
session. I'm hoping that we will be able to accomplish a lot over the course of this next hour. We're going to study the last chapter of Eikhah, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to complete that within the first 40 minutes or so we can spend a little time talking about Nechama. I know it's a couple days early, but it's never too early to start feeling good about things. I'd like to remind you of a midrash that we saw 4 weeks ago in the first session, when the midrash addressed the issue of the Abecedarian acrostic that we have in Eikhah, and that is that it shows up really 6 times, which is once each in the first, second, and fourth chapters. And then there's a threefold acrostic in the third chapter, as we saw. Now, it's not really a threefold acrostic. It's Aleph, 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 Bet, Bet, Bet. A threefold acrostic would have been Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dal, He, Tav 3 times. But nonetheless, we'll be flexible with that and consider it to be 6. But that led us to this strange midrash. This midrash is commenting on the pasuk in Vayikra at the end, which is the Tochecha, which continually works with the number 7. The Tochecha there seems to be related to the issue of Shemitah, and it works with the number 7. And consistently, there's a threat, and then the promise that if you don't abide, this threat doesn't impact you, then I'm going to make it worse. As you see in source 1, I will punish you 7-fold. So the midrash here, which is a midrash in Eikhah, in one of the tichtaot, one of the poems, Atem avartem lefanai sheva averot, and that's the theme, by the way, that we find in Tanakh itself, and certainly in the midrash, the idea of 7 different sins, not particular sins and not deadly sins, but 7 particular sins, almost all relating to avodah zarah, etc. Harei Yirmiyahu ba'al mekonen alechem kinot shu sheva alpha beitin. So hold on a second. So that the midrash here is picking up on the idea that there are 7 alphabetic acrostics, Abecedarian acrostics in Eikhah to correspond with the 7 sins that Am Yisrael did that led to this destruction. Now, the problem, of course, is that there aren't 7, there are 6, as I mentioned. But if you look at the last parak of Eikhah, you will see something curious. It does not follow, it's different than the other prakim in significant ways. Structurally, it's different in 2 ways. The first way is that the psukim, as you could see, are much shorter. They're not as short as the psukim in Perek Gimel, which are typically 5-6 words each, but there's 3 per letter. But they are much shorter than the psukim in Aleph, Bet, and Dalet. More critically, they are not an Abecedarian acrostic. They start with a Zayin, then a Nun, then a Yod, etc. They're all over the place, seemingly, and that's as far as the structure goes. As far as the content goes, which is far more to our interest, and the substance of it, you'll notice that the voice is no longer the voice of Yirmiyahu, nor the feigned voice of the city. It's now the voice of the people, which is exactly what we've been waiting for the whole time, which means that on a macro level, Yirmiyahu was successful. He may not have been successful immediately, but he was successful in that he got the people to act, to talk, to respond. And as you will see, their response really hits home. And we'll take a look at it through. The other thing to notice is that the style, the expression that we find in Perek Hey is an expression that should be very familiar to us, because it's the style upon which kinot are built. The kinot, which remember is the rabbinic name for Eikhah, but the kinot that we recite and that were composed typically in the early medieval period and through the medieval period, and there are even kinot that were composed in the last few years, There were, of course, famous keynote written about the Shoah. There are keynote that were written after the Yom Kippur War. And there were a teacher of mine wrote a kina, which became somewhat popular after the pullout from Gaza. So there are keynote continue to be written, and they all follow this particular style, not the Eikhah style for the most part, but rather first person describing what we've seen, what we've experienced, and often contrasting what we've seen and experienced with the way things used to be. But the focus here is not how great it was, we've lost it, but rather how terrible our circumstances are now. Now keep that in mind, because if you recall, for instance, at Perek Dalet, which we did last week, there is a constant reference point of how great things were. The young men of Zion who were wearing gold, and now they're considered like shards of pottery. There's this constant back and forth of these people who used to be so honored are now begging for food in the streets, etc. Here, there's not a whole lot of that. Here, the focus is really on the now. One thing I'd like you to think about as we read through the Perek is when. And I'm going to go back to now to the body of Eikhah. And the body of Eikhah, when I say that, I mean the first four prakim. And you'll see why by the end of the shiur I'm suggesting that. When you look at the body of Eikhah itself, if you ask the question when, what would your answer be? Right? I'm going to open it up. What do you think? When would the first four prakim of Eikhah have been composed and presented for the first time? What do you think? Think about what's in it. Think about what's not in it. I'll even ask you location. Where would Eikhah have first been composed and presented?
Location, Yerushalayim, and environs, as far as, let's say, Mitzvah, where Gedalia was. And time, I would say, from about the time of Gedalia's assassination till at least 560. Although a whole generation of keynote is reflected here.
I'm sorry, can you say that a little more clearly?
A whole generation of keynote is reflected here. And they all come from Jerusalem.
I'm asking about the first four prakim of Eikhah.
I'm sorry?
The first four prakim of Eikhah, the body of Eikhah.
I'm saying the whole body of Eikhah was written over a period of about, maybe 15 years after the Korban. And this last chapter, I'd say about 10 years after that.
I'm not going to the last chapter yet. I'm just asking about the first four.
Okay. And the location of the first four is Jerusalem or its immediate environs, like chapter 3 could very easily be its immediate environs.
So we have several difficulties with that. I'm not disagreeing with you, but I'm just suggesting that the body of Eikhah seems to be actually much more immediate. It seems to be really in the shadow of the Khurban. I would even place it during the immediate aftermath of the destruction, and because the descriptions of the children dying in the streets, which is during the siege, which happened before the destruction, happened for the 2.5 years or so, from 588 to 586 or so, is very immediate, and it's immediate and still paralyzing. I agree with you that it's in or around Yerushalayim, but if it's in or around Yerushalayim, that means that it's in the immediate aftermath, because afterwards Yerushalayim was off limits. We're no longer in Yerushalayim. Remember, Gedalia is not Yerushalayim. However, this next parak is problematic, and you'll see why, meaning to fit it within the same time frame. All right, so let's take a look. Zachor Adonai mehayalanu habita ur'eyat cherpatenu. Now, by the way, you can almost envision this, I think you can envision this, as being a recitative, a call and response, where a leader says, Zachor Adonai mehayalanu, and everybody answers, Habitu ur'eyat cherpatenu. And again, this, unlike the rest of Eikhah, follows regular Shirah meter. Remember that Kinam meter that we had in the first four prakim, especially 1, 2, and 4, is imbalanced. Very long psukim with imbalanced halves. Three phrases and 2 phrases, something like that. Here, it's really 2 and 2, 1 clause on each side, and the meter is balanced. And this is much more populous. This is what people are saying. Zachor Adonai mehayalanu. Remember, Hashem, what has happened to us. Now, the factory we're using Zachor indicates that this is not immediately after the Churban, because however we deal with the issue of God remembering, it's Yom HaZikaron and Zichronot, whatever that may mean, the notion of Zechira always assumes some distance of time from the event. Otherwise, there's no need to be Zocher, it's immediate. So Zechor Adonai Mehayalanu, the people are turning to Hashem and saying, Hashem, remember what has happened to us. That doesn't mean what great things existed, what has happened, the terrible things that have happened to us. Habita ureat cherpatenu, look and see our shame. So now the people who are saying this are in a circumstance where they are now shamed. They are now in a status that we'll see described, and they're now turning to Hashem and asking Hashem to have rachamim on them, which, by the way, we haven't heard yet in Eikhah. Nachalatenu nehefcha lezarim. Now look at the words. Our land, basically, our legacy, has been taken over or taken by strangers. Batenu lenochrim. Now, I want to mention something here for a moment about biblical poetry, just to clarify.
He's doing the last chapter of Eikhah.
About Batenu lenochrim, is you'll notice that there's a missing verb here. Nachlatenu nefcha lezarim. Our land has been taken over by strangers, become that owned by strangers. Batenu lenochrim, meaning our houses are now taken by foreigners. Now, this is a common technique in biblical poetry. They're referred to as gapping. When in order to keep the meter, there is usually a verb that exists in, or an adjective that exists in one half of the pasuk, that if we were to include it in the second half of the pasuk, or it's parallel, it would become too big. And therefore it's assumed. For instance, in Mizmor Shir Le'Yom HaShabbat, which we all know. How does the Mizmor Shir Le'Yom HaShabbat begin? Tov lahodot l'Adonai u'lezamer l'shimcha elyon. Notice, it is good to give thanks to God, and then we would expect, and it is good to sing to God. But the word good is left out of the second half because it would corrupt the meter. So the same thing here. Nachlatenu nefcha lezarim, our nachala has become that of strangers, and batenu nefcha nefchu lenochrim, our houses have become owned by. So the word owned by, or taken over by, or now changed to, switched to, is assumed to strangers. And nochrim and zarim are parallel, and batenu nachlatenu are parallel. Now, by the way, now getting away from the linguistic issue, what is the description? We're looking at a land that was ours, and now it's not ours. Our houses used to be ours, they're no longer ours. And what comes to mind here, and this is not at all inappropriate here to point out, is people who survived the Shoah and then came back to their homes in Poland. I don't know if this happened in Hungary as much. In Galicia, it certainly happened, and found that while they were gone, their neighbors had moved into their homes and taken over their homes. Yitomim hayinu ve'ein av imotenu ka'almanot. And notice they're saying, we are orphans without a father. Now that's a little bit of overkill, sorry for the pun. But for orphans, that means we have no father. So notice that the second half of the pasuk helps understand what that means. Imotenu ka'almanot, our mothers are like widows. Now this operates in two fashions. First of all, it tells us that we're not necessarily functionally orphans and widows, but that we feel bereft. And so ve'ein av here may mean our feeling about HaKadosh Baruch Hu abandoning us. We feel like orphans without our father. Our mothers are like widows. This, of course, on the second level, takes us back to the very first pasuk in Eikhah. Eikhah yashva v'dad ha'ira bat yam hayta ke'almana. But now, and this is again the success of Yirmiyahu, is that Yirmiyahu finally got the people at this point to speak and express in their own words the words that he had put into the mouth of the city. or the onlookers, describing the city as a widow. And now saying that's how we feel. Meimenu b'chesef shatinu, meaning our own water that we ourselves had either filled in the cisterns or had the wells we had dug. Now we're drinking it for money, meaning we have to buy our own water, as it were. Eitzenu b'mechir yavo, our own trees, our own wood, we have to bring for price. We have to pay to get our own wood. In other words, the territory that was ours is now no longer ours. And if we want to live here, we've got to now buy it. Now, question is, when is this happening? And I'm going to posit that this is somewhat later than was earlier suggested. Al tzavarenu nirdafnu. We were chased on our necks, meaning we're chased right at us. Yaganu v'lo nachlanu. We became tired. We never found any respite, which means right now we are in a very, should we say, tired refugee position. Nobody here is dying on the spot, but we have nowhere to go. Mitzrayim natanu yad. Remember, we talked about this earlier, including in the last parak, about the hopes that the people had pinned on Mitzrayim. Tzidkiyahu signed a treaty with them, and we put out a hand to them. Ashur lisbo halachem. Now, Ashur doesn't exist anymore. Ashur is ancient history, but Ashur is a way of speaking about the East. Throughout earlier Nevi'im, Mitzrayim and Ashur represent ways of speaking about the West and the East. Find, for instance, in Yeshayahu Chaf, right? Mitzrayim, Ashur, and Yisrael, Shlishiyah, the threesome, right? So we look to the West, we look to the East for help, and of course there was nothing there. Avotenu chatu ve'inam. Our ancestors sinned, and they're no longer here. Now, who are our ancestors here? Meaning, who's speaking that they're talking about their ancestors sinning? V'anachnu avonotehem savalnu. We are suffering for their sins. Now, this is a little difficult because where is the tshuva? Tshuva is never on pinning it on somebody else. And so saying, nonetheless, we're recognizing that what happened here happened because somebody sinned. We're saying our ancestors sinned, and they're no longer around, and we're suffering for their sins. This, by the way, seems to be in dialogue with Yechezkel Yodchet. When Yechezkel in Bavel says to the people, you guys keep saying, Avot achlu voser v'shinei varim tikena. Fathers eat sour grapes, and the sons' teeth are set on edge, which is a mashal, it's an aphorism for saying that one generation sins, and they have a great time, and they don't get punished, and their kids suffer for it. He says that's not the way to look at it. The way to look at it is each person either merits or suffers because of their own behavior, right? And so now, avadim mashluvanu. Slaves are now ruling over us, which of course is, if you take a look at the end of Mishlei, is like a terrible thing to see. A slave ruling over a free man. Ruling over Gevirta. Horek ein mi adam. Now, who are these slaves who are ruling over us, and nobody can redeem us from them? Question is, where and when is this? Now, again, this is no longer, and this is removed by time and circumstance from the first four prakim. We are now not looking at children dying in the streets. We're not looking at people being slaughtered. What we're looking at is the aftermath of that, when our national circumstance has changed radically as a result. B'nafshenu navi lachmenu mibnei cherev hamidbar. We have to bring our own bread. It takes our entire life. In other words, we have to put a lot of effort in just to get food because of the threat from the outside. Oreinu ketanur nichmaru. Now, this we had in the previous parak, the description of the fine young men who then became so emaciated that their skin stuck to their skin. Here, Oreinu ketanur nichmaru nezil afot rav. Our skin became black, like it was in an oven. The imagery is too painful to continue with, because of all of the horrendous famine that existed. Nashim b'tzion inu. Now, by the way, this is now going backwards, meaning this is what happened, not what we're saying. They afflicted, we'll say, raped women in Sion, betulot barei Yehuda. Sarim biadam nitlu. And again, this is not what we're looking at. Remember, what we're looking at, we've heard in the first few psukim. Our land no longer belongs to us. We have to work hard to bring food from our own fields and pay for it. We have to work hard to bring water from our own cisterns and we have to pay for it, etc. And now there is going backwards and saying, what's the gap between where this whole thing started and where we are now? And they're describing the terrors of the conquest. Starim biadam nitlu pnei zkenim lo nadaru. And this evokes the earlier prakim, including the first parak, of the great dishonor shown to the leaders, to the zkenim, etc. Bachurim techon nasau unarim be'etz kashalu. So the young men had to work with this very hard thing and carry these hard loads. Zkenim mishar shavatu. Bachurim biniginatam. And the elders were kept away from the gates. A moment about the gates in a second. And the young men from their singing and celebrating. So two motifs here I just want to mention because they're prominent in Tanakh. The second one is quicker. Bachurim biniginatam. The image that's consistently used in Tanakh for a healthy society is young men and women, vibrant, full of life, rejoicing, dancing, drinking, singing, drinking not to excess, but celebrating life. That is seen as a sign of a robust society. When the young men no longer have their homes of singing, their houses of singing, as it were, right? Which of course we evoke in the positive, in the last bracha of Birchat Chatanim. That's a sign of loss. Now, the shar is a different story. What is the shar? So when you think of a shar, and you translate a shar as a gate, you think of a hole in the wall. Here's a wall, there's a hole in it, that's a gate. That's not what a gate is. A gate in Tanakh is a whole area. You think about Mordechai sitting b'shar HaMelech. He's not sitting in front of a wall, he's sitting in the offices of the city, the government offices. All of the major offices in walled cities were held within the casement of the gates. That's why the Torah commands us, Shoftim v'shotrim titin lecha b'chol sharecha. You put judges and officers in all of your gates, meaning that's where the offices are. For the zikenim, to think about the scene of Boaz in the Shar and the zikenim at the end of Ruth. So for zikenim to no longer be in the Shar means that they're no longer doing their thing. They're no longer leading the community and judging, etc. And this leads to the broader statement, which is Shavat misos libeinu, our rejoicing has stopped. Nepach le'evel mecholenu. And Evel and Machol are constant opposites, constant antonyms in Tanakh. Hafacht mispedi le'macholi, right, in the opposite direction. Nepach le'evel mecholenu. Now, Machol is a dance, but it's a particular kind of dance. It is a circle dance. It necessitates having a group. We have the women coming out to greet David and Shaul after the pursuit of the Plishtim, after the death of Goliath. They come out Lashir v'ham Mecholot. Miriam leads the women out in Mecholot. It's a circle dance. So circle dance is a powerful image because it's not only celebratory, but it's also a group together, and they're working together. And of course, Avilut is all about isolation. So Nepach le'evel mecholenu, our Machol has been turned into Avilut. Now, and this is working on the theme that we've seen, especially in Parak Daled, of contrasting what was with what is. Nafla ateret roshenu oina lanu kichatanu. This, by the way, is a phrase that's used frequently in Pashkevillian when a great rabbi dies. The phrase is Nafla ateret roshenu. Our crown has fallen, but in a very literal sense, our crown has fallen. We no longer have a king, and our glory is gone. Oina lanu kichatanu. And here's finally when it breaks through. We have sinned, not our ancestors. We have sinned, and therefore this is the terrible thing that has happened to us. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that we're recognizing that not only they sinned, but we sinned also? Or is there an understanding of multi-generational unity and saying, if they sinned, that's part of us. meaning we have to accept responsibility for it. Can't fix it until we acknowledge it and work towards it. So in any case, either way that we're doing it, they are now finally acknowledging their own role in their state right now. Al zeh hayada veli beinu. And here is where things shift. I want to remind you that within our collective awareness and collective consciousness, if you ask somebody what Tisha B'Av is about and you give them 3 seconds to give a quick answer, they will say destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. And that's the first thing that comes to mind. And Chazal stressed that when they identified the 5 things that happened on Tisha B'Av historically, and 2 of them are the Churban Beit HaMikdash. Important to note that in Tanakh, the Mikdash was destroyed on the 7th of Av or the 10th of Av. The 9th of Av is not mentioned in Tanakh. The second Mikdash is destroyed maybe on the 9th, maybe on the 10th. But the 9th is the day that we focus on Churban Beit HaMikdash, and we coalesce it together. Just an interesting note, the Karaites fast on the 7th and the 10th of Av because of the 2 dates in the Tanakh. I'm just pointing that out. But throughout Eikhah, and I pointed this out, I think every week, is the mention of the Mikdash is hardly found. The Mikdash is not the focal point of mourning. The focal point of mourning is 2 things: the terrible scene of children dying in their own mother's arms, and everything kind of goes along with that, and in parallel of the elders and the way that the elders are being treated and what's happened to them. And on the other hand, the destruction of the city. The Mikdash is hardly mentioned. And here there seems to be, and I'm going to argue that it is with the distance of time, a refocusing. Al zeh hayada veli beinu. And by the way, there's a common minig in many communities that when we get to the 5th parak, and this is again part of the 5th parak being the beginning of Kinot, is the community starts reading along. The first 4 parakim, for the most part, we're listening. There was somebody quietly reading. We get to the 5th parak, people start reading along, and it builds up. It's a very powerful thing. It builds up, and by the time you get to this, people are reading fairly loud, along with the leader. Al zeh hayada veli beinu al eila chashchu einenu. This is what our hearts were so sad for. It's for these that our eyes went dark. What is it? We're waiting to hear. Is it the children dying in their arms? Is it the old people no longer being in the gates? Al har Tzion sheshamem shualim hilchuvo. That har Tzion, which here seems to be another way of saying Har HaMoriah or Har HaBayit, which is not Har Tzion, not our Har Tzion, that it's desolate and foxes walk there. And the reason that this seems to be about Har HaBayit is the next line, Ata Adonai le'olam teshev kisacha l'dor vador. You, God, are ensconced there forever. Your throne is there for generation to generation. And this seems to be making a statement of an ironic statement of saying, even though the Mikdash is destroyed, even though there are now foxes walking around that mountain, nonetheless, your presence is still there and it's never going to leave. However, lama lanetzach tishkachenu. How can you forget us forever? Ta'azveinu la'orech yamim. And abandon us for such a long time. Such a long time puts a little bit of a climp into Lanetzach. So it's not Lanetzach, not forever, but for such a long time. Now, when would this be said? When would somebody make a statement to have abandoned us for many, many years if this is a few years after the Korban? So we have to keep in mind. And now, a very popular pasuk, which is the penultimate pasuk of the reading, but ends up being the ultimate pasuk of the reading. And by this time, by the way, in most communities, everybody's singing along. Hashivenu Adonai Elecha v'nashuva. Notice, Shuvah now becomes prominent. However, our request is, you bring us back and we'll return. You bring us back and we'll return may mean give us the wherewithal, the inspiration, whatever it may be, to do Shuvah, and also may mean bring us back home and we will come back. Kadesh Yameinu Kekedem. And we're asking for the good old days. We're asking for you to renew our days as of old, meaning what we've described in Eikhah as what was. The young men of Zion in their gold, the old people being honored, etc. Bring us back to that. However, the Megilat ends on a very sour note. Key here being king rather. And we're asking you to bring us back and renew our days as of old. However, the reality is, Ma'os me'astanu, you have actually rejected us. Katsafta aleinu ad meod, you are very, very angry with us. Now notice, you've rejected us, you're very angry at us is two very different statements, two almost opposite statements. Rejected, and as we saw earlier, abandoned means I'm done with you guys, I'm finished, well, I'm out of here. To be angry with us means you're very much involved and you're punishing us because you have expectations of us. We have unlived expectations. You made a promise that if we behave in such a way, we're going to be punished. And now that's what we're suffering from. That's a very different take. And what we do in our custom is, this is one of the four books in Tanakh that end with a very sour pasuk, or frightening pasuk, and these are four books that the end of the book is read publicly. The others are Kohelet, which is read on Sukkot, and Malachi, which is read as Haftarah on Shabbat HaGadol, and Yeshayahu, which is read on the Shabbat. The last part of Yeshayahu is read at Shabbat Rosh Chodesh, and Eikhah all end with unpleasant phrases. So what we do in every case is we go back and read the pasuk. It's the penultimate pasuk. We read it again, and it's all. And in the case of Kohelet and Eikhah, it's actually read by the public, and that is Hashivenu Adonai Lecha V'Nashuva Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem, which ends with a bit of hope. But of course, our custom is immediately after that we go into the keynote, which, as I said, are built on the fifth parak. Right, the first kina in many communities is Oy Mehayalanu, which is right here in the parak. So we've seen what the description is. The question is, who's saying this and when? Is this being said along with Eikhah? Very difficult to suggest that for several reasons. First of all, because the substance is very different. It's no longer about seeing the perils in front of us, but it's about describing the aftermath, the result. The second thing is that, more critically to our point, the paralysis has been broken. The people are speaking. It's all the people. There's no Mekonen here. There's no city talking. It's the people talking, describing what has happened to them, and where things are at. And so this parak does seem to be of a later period. How much later and by whom? I'll make a suggestion in a little bit.
You call this Torah harmony of dissonance, which sounds.
Gershon, you have to speak more clearly. I can't understand you.
You called this Torah harmony of dissonance, which sounds what's happening in Eretz Yisrael today.
Could be. I don't want to get into any current politics. We have enough problems with marches and pacemakers. I'm going to stay away. But there certainly is lots in Eikhah that we need to reflect on in our current situation. If you take a look at the structure that I'm suggesting here, the first set of psukim are again describing what is and what has happened and what our state is, and we went through it. And at the end, there is a declaration, and the declaration is, you God are here forever, and now there's almost a demand. You're here forever. We have enshrined you forever. Don't abandon us forever. And we want to come back. And even though the Megilah ends with the reality that you have rejected us and you are angry with us, nonetheless, we're asking you to bring us back. Again, I just want to clarify what I meant about the last pasuk. Lim'os, to reject, means to find something disgusting and to just be rid of it. And it seems that that's what God has done. I'm just finished with you guys. But to be angry at someone is a very different take. You think about it, what's the worst thing that a parent can do to a child? Besides anything, obviously abuse, but what the worst thing that a parent can do to a child is to ignore the child. For the parent to get angry with the child, when appropriate, is a sign of love. I have expectations of you. I know you're better than this. Obviously, you have to do it right, you have to do it the proper way, etc. But it shows love, it shows concern. The children who grow up in environments in which everything's acceptable and everything else don't think that their parents love them, they think their parents don't care. Now, I'm talking in extreme cases. So we've shifted from ma'os me'astanu, which is a rejection and turning away, to katzaf talin amreon, which is love and connection, but anger because of expectations of how we should be. I want to finish our analysis of the fifth parak because I want to leave a little bit of time for Nechama by pointing out a couple of things about this parak. The first thing is something that I'm going to make this a little bigger for us, is something that I happened to chance upon when I was looking through the stacks at the finest Judaica collection west of Chicago, which is an UCLA library, and I was leafing through an old issue of the Sinai Journal, and I found a one-page piece by Azriel Rosenfeld in which he suggested that the acrostic in this parak is actually a meaningful acrostic, meaning our psukim here, Zechor Adonai Mehayalanu, is actually an acrostic, even though it's not an aleph bet. You take a look at the opening, Zechor Adonai. So that's a name. Whose name might that be? If you had to make a name out of Zechor Hashem, what name would you make?
Zachariah.
Before going ahead, I want to just point out that this is something that we refer to as a colophon. A colophon is a signature, basically, that appears either usually at the beginning or the end of a work. Often it's explicit, but sometimes it's hidden in acrostics of source that refers to the author or sometimes the scribe in many medieval manuscripts who did it. We're familiar with colophons, obviously, from Zmirot on Shabbat. All the Zmirot on Shabbat that we have, the name of the author is encoded into it. So Yisrael Najara and how do you call it, Yari Ben Olam, as an example. So his suggestion is that this is a colophon acrostic, because in the next 5 phrases are Habit Aret Cherpatenu, Nachlatenu Nefchal Zarim, Batenu Lenochrim, Yotomim Hayinu Vein Av, Imotenu Kalmanot actually spells out Zechariah Navi. Right? And I think there is certainly what to recommend that Zechariah Navi, who plays a prominent role, maybe the most prominent role in the rebuilding of the Mikdash, and in the way that we need to look at that rebuilding and at that opportunity. Take a look at Zechariah Zayin and Chet, and I'll tell you a story about it in a minute. Was the leader. If you take a look at Ezra, Perek, Hey, Pasuk Aleph and Bet, Ezra, Zechariah, and Haggai were the 2 leaders who inspired the rebuilding. They were Nevi'im in Yerushalayim at the time of the rebuilding, which takes us about 2 generations after the Churban, because the rebuilding began around 60 years after the Churban. It was completed 70 years after the Churban. It was delayed for a while. It was completed just about 70 years afterwards, in the year 515 BCE. And it would make a lot of sense that Zechariah would be the one to compose this parak. In other words, my suggestion is, and I'm arguing in favor of Rosenfeld, is that this parak was composed and said in Yerushalayim by the returnees. They're looking around, they're saying, our land is no longer our land. We're living on Persian land now. We're living in a Jewish province, Yehud Madinta, in the Persian land. And what they're describing about the past is accurate. What they're describing about the present is a little exaggerated to make a point. And it's the idea that we're suffering terribly. The reality is life was very difficult there, but they did have a lot of rights there under the Persian Empire. But in any case, that seems to be what's going on. If you take a look at the, and I'm not sure where that came from. Somebody put that on the screen. Okay. If you take a look at the parak, you'll also see something interesting happening. Is again, parak K is not the 5th of 5. Parak Hay stands alone. The four Parakim work together and work as a sequential development of an argument, basically presented by Yirmiyahu to try to get the people to respond. And again, within Eikhah, it doesn't really work. But here, you take a look and you'll see that the themes in the fifth parak take us back to every one of the earlier parakim, right? You notice that after the opening line of the piece, the fact that our land has become that of others echoes the theme of the first parak. The fact that we are bereft without leaders and the people are suffering echoes the fourth parak, or the second parak. The third parak really sits by itself, as we saw 2 weeks ago. But the fact that that which we owned is now something we have to go and buy really echoes the fourth parak. And if you follow the line through, you will see that the entire fifth parak goes in chiastic fashion in response to the first four parakim. It does not sit by itself. And notice that when we get to the middle and to the end of the parak, it again goes to those that were great are now lower, that, the contrast of what was. Then the theme of Parak Bet, which is the terrible terrors in Yerushalayim. And then at the very end of the parak echoes the theme of the first parak, which is this great city, the city that was a glory for the whole world, that everybody would come to, is now bereft and all alone. And that takes us to the end of the parak. Give me 1 second. I'm going to bring this up here. And okay, at this point, what I'd like to ask you before going for the last 15 minutes or so to the theme of Nechama is, okay, so I want to first of all comment on some of the questions that somebody asked. Yeah, the sources that are posted are the ones you see on the screen. 2 sets were sent out, and I'm about to share the second one with you. And I believe you all have access to them. Somebody asked, is Yirmiyahu considered to be the author of this parak as well? Chazal don't make that distinction. Chazal say that Yirmiyahu is the author of Kinot, but again, they say that about Yoshua being the author of Yeshua, and then they have to contend with the end of Yoshua, where Yoshua is dead. They say the same thing about Shmuel. They have to contend with that. So, question is the last parak, and I believe that it can be successfully argued that the last parak is of a later period from the approach, not the style necessarily, but from the approach. Okay, somebody here mentioned the issue of Al Naharot Bavel, which is a shir I'll be giving on Thursday in Deal. And yes, so somebody here suggested that the parak sounds as if it was written in the early days of Galut Bavel. Certainly, that could be the case. And then you would make the argument that the description of the land is not one in which they are there seeing, but rather something that they're being told about or remembering. So it's certainly possible that this is a Babylonian composition and being expressed by the Golei Bavel in Bavel. It's also possible that it is that next generation that came back to Israel, and they're in Yerushalayim and looking around and seeing the city that used to be the glory, and this is what's happened to it. But again, I believe that it can be successfully argued that this last parak has a separation of at least one, if not two generations from the events. Okay. If anybody else has a question, just open it up and ask, because I don't want to go back to the chats, and then we'll have a few minutes to talk about Nechama. Okay. The tradition, which is a very old tradition, this is a comment about Haftarot. We read Haftarot, the argument is made, although we haven't yet been able to substantiate this with corroborating evidence, documentary evidence, but the suggestion that was made very early on, that there was a particular point in time when whoever it was, some say the Greeks, some say the Romans, made a decree against the public reading of the Torah. And as a result of that, the notion was to read some sections from the Nevi'im that would sort of take its place. And two different customs developed. And that was that in Bavel, the custom was, and it's the custom we follow, to thematically imitate what was missed in the Torah reading. And therefore, the Parshat Shlach, which is about the Meraglim, we read about the Meraglim of Yoshua. Quick example. In Eretz Yisrael, a different custom arose, and we actually have the list of the Haftarot that were practiced in Eretz Yisrael when they read the Torah over the course of about 3.5 years, which was that they would pick a passage from the Nevi'im that started with the same significant word that the Torah reading that was missed. And thematically can be totally separate, as long as the word matched. In any case, we have the Babylonian custom. However, the halacha of a haftarah, which is presented in black letter law in Mishnah Megilat, the Tosefta Megilah, essentially guides you on what sort of passage to pick. In other words, there are rules what you can pick from the Nevi'im, but not particular parshiot. In other words, a person would get up there, and if they wanted to, and there was a story of Breshit, they could have read something from Yeshayahu about creation. They could have read something from Yirmiyahu about creation. They could have read something from Amos about creation. There are different creation stories in Tanakh. They could have picked whatever they wanted, as long as it fit certain contours of a certain amount of psukim minimum, etc. Over time, particular customs developed, but you can see how late a practice it is. Different customs developed, and they became more hardwired as to what we read for the Haftarah. The reason I mentioned you can see how late it is because, as we know from all the Haftarot, that Haftarot have varied customs. Right? The famous story about a guy who was very nervous and was reading the Haftarah, and at the end of the Haftarah, he intoned, Kan Mesaimim Ashkenazim, because it said in his note, this is where the Ashkenazim finished. He read that as part of the Haftarah. But the idea is that, the Ashkenazim finish here, the Italians start there, the Yemenites stay there, they read a whole different Haftarah, etc. And that shows you how late the hardwired nature of Haftarot are, or the list, because they happen after we're already dispersed. However, there are certain Haftarot that are mentioned in the Mishnah, Haftarot typically for the Chagim. And in the Tannaitic literature, there are mentions of Haftarot around this season. Believe it or not, the Haftarah that's mentioned for the Shabbat we just had is Eikhah Tal, which is in the middle of the Haftarah that we do. Our practice is not like the Mishnah. However, relatively early on, the custom of having these 7 Haftarot from the second half of Yeshayahu, I'm not going to go into the issue of authorship, but the second half of Yeshayahu, the Pirkei Nechama, and these 7, and in the order that we have, is something that is relatively old. It goes back to maybe the 7th century, if not earlier. And in the Psikta, there's a presentation of these 7, along with the 3 that we read during the weeks that we're now finishing, and presentation. And so that means that not only the themes here, but the sequence of these themes are significant. So I'd like to just pose one question, which is why 7 weeks? In other words, I understand 3 weeks because the minute that we associate Shiva Asar B'Tammuz with Tisha B'Av and create a single period between the two, as opposed to just 2 separate fasts, so then it becomes a period with a certain tone of mourning, and so there's a buildup of the Haftarot to the intensity that we reached this past Shabbat, and we'll reach again on Thursday with Haftarah from Yirmiyahu on Tisha B'Av. But why 7 Haftarot of Nechama? So I'd like to suggest that the 7 Haftarot of Nechama actually replicate or kind of echo the notion of Shivat Yimei Avelut. Because when somebody is mourning, on Tisha B'Av, by the way, we behave somewhat like mourners, but we also behave somewhat like onanim. People who are absolutely paralyzed. A mourner wears tefillin. Our common custom is not to wear tefillin. So in the afternoon, we sort of shift from onain to avel. The Rav spoke about this quite a bit. But the 7 weeks that we have from Tisha B'Av until Rosh Hashanah seem to be kind of in a macro way, in a mild macro way, the experience of Shivat Yemei Avilut, where we come to be Menachem others, we're now being Menachem each other. And we're allowing Yeshayahu's words to be Menachem each other. So very quickly, and you'll find a lot more even in the headers in this, so we don't finish. What happens on the day itself of when morning begins? When morning begins, the person is in shock. They've just finished doing everything they can do. They've buried their dead, and now they start to try to look at life now without the person there. And it starts with Nachamu Nachamu Ami Omar Elohechem. Who's Nachamu Nachamu Ami? What does that mean? It sounds like comfort each other. Because God's saying Nachamu, he's not saying Nachem to the Navi. The Navi is saying in God's word, in God's voice, you should all comfort my nation. Be comforting each other. Right? And the word is that it's now over. What's very powerful here is that the Haftarah carries with it, and the next Prakim and Yeshayahu also carry with them a strong theme of creation. If you take a look, for instance, at the last pasuk, it's all about creation. But take a look at the rest of the parak. It's all about creation. It's about who's in charge. And that's kind of where Nechama starts. Nechama starts with saying there's somebody in charge. Because the first feeling of an onain and then of an avel is what we expressed in the 5th parak, is abandonment. So the statement is you're not abandoned. God's in charge, God's there, and God's now saying that you should be comforted. The next step is actually a dialogue. It starts out beautifully. Vatomer Tzion azavani Adonai v'Adonai shchechani. Tzion says, God has abandoned me. Totally evoking and echoing what we saw in the 5th parak. Ad ana tishkachenu. And what's God's answer? This is the answer to the 5th parak. Hatishkach isha ulam mirachem bebina. Could a mother ever forget the child that she bore? Even that, a mother might forget her kid. I would never forget you. And he continues with the theme of God always having our interest, never abandoning us. And it ends with this beautiful line. By the way, this word Nachem shows up throughout. God has comforted Sion. He's comforted all of its destroyed places, which means he's going to rebuild them. This should evoke the current, the modern period that we have. He took her desert and turned it into Eden. It's desolate places, or its plains, into the garden of Hashem, which takes us back to a priest's dome image. And now there'll be rejoicing that takes place. But again, this is very distant, very difficult. When somebody's mourning, tell them all these great things that happen, fine, okay, good. In the meantime, it's not reality for them. And so it continues. And the next step in the 3rd week in normal years, as we have this year, last year was different because Rosh Chodesh Elul changes the order of things. But in a normal year like this year, there is a description of what the future is going to look like. A beautiful, glorious future. In the 5th week, there's finally an interaction, although there was in the 2nd week, but now, in the 4th week, there's an interaction with the Menachem. God starts out and says, Anochi, Anochi hu Menachemchem. Other people come in, I'm the one who's being Menachem you, right? And this also includes some very powerful passages. I mean, all of it's powerful. But you see in Pasuk Aleph here in the next parak, Uri livshi uzeh livshi tzion livshi bigdei tifartet Yerushalayim Yerakodesh leosif yavovach od arel v'tamei. Now this, of course, was adopted by Alkabetz. Narim yafarkumi shri Yerushalayim. Right. So now Yerushalayim should wake up. This evokes for us Uri dvorah. Uri livshi uzeh tzion. Tzion, get up and put on your glory, put on your strength. In other words, it's time for you to shake all of this off and stand up. And one of the most beautiful passages anywhere, I'll put my money on it, is in Pasuk Zayin, Man navu al harim raglei mevaser, mashmiya shalom mevaser tov, mashmiya Yeshua. Maybe that I find this because I grew up in a home of Israeli folk dancing. So Manavu, some of you may remember the dance. Manavu al harim raglei mevaser. How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of the one who's bringing the news, which in later Nevi'im we understand to be Eliyahu. Mashmiya shalom mevaser tov, mashmiya Yeshua. He's announcing peace. He's giving good news. He's announcing salvation. Omer l'Tzion malach Elohayich. He's telling Tzion malach Elohayich. Now, by the way, this is not new. This is a theme that shows up this coming Shabbat. All right, take a look at Pasuk Tet. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because this is something that happens in the course of Nechama. Al har gavoa lilach v'aseret Tzion. The Navi says, you, mevaseret, same word, you are bringing glad tidings to Tzion, go up to a high mountain. This is where, by the way, Mevaseret Tzion gets its name from this pasuk. Harimi v'koach kolech mevaseret Yerushalayim. Go up, and you who are bringing good news to Yerushalayim, lift up your voice loud. Harimi al tirai, don't be afraid. Imri le'arei Yehuda hine Elohechem. Go tell Yehuda that your God has come. But of course, you tell somebody something on the first day of Nechama, and they can't necessarily hear it. You have to say it because it has to be said. And here on the fifth day, on the fourth day, it is repeated. Because now maybe they're ready to hear it. Now we're talking not days, but weeks, and not talking about individuals, but the nation. Maybe there's more room, more ability to hear it. We get to the fifth week, and there is now anticipation, not just of Nechama, but anticipation of greatness. Remember, Eikhah didn't start with, we were a humdrum people who got nailed. We were a glorious people who got the shovel. And so now the notion of returning to that greatness is here. We have 2 minutes, so I'm just going to say the following. If anybody has this request, years ago I wrote a 2-part article going through the Haftarot and explaining in much more detail. If anybody's interested, please send me an email, and I'll be happy to send you the 2-part article out to you, immediately. And it goes through detail through all the Haftarot and explains the sequence. But I just wanted to give you in a short way, and I didn't want to end our series as much as it's 2 days before Tisha B'Av, 3 days before Tisha B'Av. Still wanted to end it with some Nechama. In the 6th week, there is a restoration, because now the image that the Navi presents is an image of kavod, an image of glory, an image of greatness. And what's critical is the very last passage. The last passage, which is on the 7th week, is one of redemption, and one in which the redeemed are approximating a bride and a groom. So we've gone from being disheveled and in the dirt to knowing that there's somebody there, to knowing that there's a good future, to suddenly being able to anticipate a beautiful future, to ultimately being the crowning king and queen, as it were. Parenthetically, this Haftarah Sosasis is mentioned in the Rishonim as being a Haftarah. In some communities still have this practice. It's read by a Chatan during Shabbat Chatan. Shabbat Chatan is not what we call the Ufuf. Shabbat Chatan is the Shabbat during the week of celebration. And in many communities, this is the Haftarah that's read by the Chatan, not the regular Haftarah. Sosasis. And that is, if you take a look in the opening line, it ends with a powerful line. I want to end with this because the last line of all 7 Haftarot is B'chol tzaratam lo tsar, u'malach panav hoshiam. Now, look at the word lo. In the faint piece, I wrote the Ktiv, it's written Lamed Aleph, but we read it Lamed Vav, which means we read it the same way it's written, but we have a different meaning. What does B'chol tzaratam lo tsar mean? In all of their troubles, there's no trouble, which is strange. But how does it read? B'chol tzaratam lo tsar, in all of their troubles, he's troubled. And if you think about it, that is exactly the greatest Nechama. The very fact that when we're in pain, God is in pain, as it were. The very fact that God Ki'ilu suffers with us is perhaps the greatest nechama and is what really removes the sense of pain. And that seems to be the ultimate theme of this whole entire nechama, is that God is saying, I'm with you, I love you, I'm bringing you back, and all of the greatness that was described in Eikhah as being part of our legacy is also our destiny. I want to wish everybody a very meaningful fast. I really do hope that this year Tisha B'Av is more meaningful as a result of having studied together, and I do hope that maybe we can do something in the next couple of days, but certainly by next year we should study Eikhah and learn how to lane it in Esther Trope, and Emir Hashem have a very powerful experience of nechama in which we're all menachem each other. One thing I think we all have to keep in mind, it's something that people are hopefully speaking about a little bit, is the biggest lesson of this entire season is not about cities, not about walls, not about buildings. It's about people. And it's about how people treat each other and how much we take care of the disenfranchised and we look after those people who need to be taken care of. And the extent to which we do that will promise us a great future. And the extent to which we ignore that, we see what happens. And so we really need to take, and this is exactly what Zechariah says in Perek Chet, we need to keep in mind the causes of the Churban in order to fix it and get to a point where we no longer have to mourn. Thank you.